I haven't told many people this, but in high school I had a few nicknames. I haven't told people because as I've mentioned to you before, I've been trying for years to get people to call me my Lord. I didn't want to muddy the water. My nicknames included the track team handle Fritz, because my hair was frizzy. I wish it had been Blitz, because I was so quick. I was also called Professor, probably because I took history classes for all my electives, but I like to think it was because of my profound ponderings under a tree in the quad. The last semester of my senior year, I was called John the Baptist, not because folks wanted my head to roll, but because I played the role of John in Godspell. I was also called Pinko, and not because of the color of my skin, but because I was an advocate for peace and for the well-being of all people. And folks that didn't cotton to those ideas labeled me, folks like me, a communist. And this amused me to no end because the label usually came from churchgoers, and my ideas came from Jesus, even though I was not a Christian at the time. There's a Facebook meme with a picture of Jesus and these words: the most effective activist in the history of the world was Yeshua of Nazareth. Yeshua is what Jesus' contemporaries knew him as. If anyone in his time were to have called Yeshua Jesus, no one, including Jesus, would have recognized that name as being his. Yeshua was his name in Hebrew. The direct translation in English is Joshua. Both Yeshua and Joshua mean Yahweh saves, which, as it turns out, is a very good birth name for Jesus. Through Yeshua of Nazareth, Yahweh does indeed save. I mentioned before that the name Jesus is actually a transliteration of Yeshua from the Greek and Latin versions of the word into English. You might see it sort of an English nickname for Yeshua of Nazareth. And I'm happy to report that unlike my unsuccessful efforts to be known as Milord, M-I-L-O-R-D, Jesus has been successful in being called my Lord, M-Y-L-O-R-D, and rightfully so. But I find it a shame that the Jesus whom many follow does not seem to be Yeshua of Nazareth. Not only did he have a name that's different than we know him by, but he also had a different face than the one we recognize him by as well. Jesus did not really look like the picture on the communion table. More importantly, Jesus had a whole different way he created and led than the way many claim he created and led today. Jesus' way was not about judgment, it was not about exclusion, elitism, condemnation, or hate. Jesus' way was and is about non-judgment, inclusivity, egalitarianism, and most of all, love. Love with no strings attached. Here's a portrait of what anthropologists suggest Yeshua of Nazareth would more likely have looked like. It's at best an estimate, since there are no photos or renderings of the real Jesus, and the Bible doesn't tell us much about his looks. What the anthropologists did was make a composite of what a male Jewish peasant in Jesus' day and location was likely to look like. Notice that Jesus does not have blue eyes. He doesn't look Caucasian like the other Jesus on the table. He looks like a man of color from the Mideast, which is what Jesus was. That colorful rendition hangs on a wall in my office and stares at me as I work, and I pass by him every time I walk in and out of my office. It's there to remind me that Jesus is not who we've been typically led to believe he is. Jesus is altogether someone not of our making, but of God's making. Jesus, Yeshua, was not about judging, condemning, or excluding. He wasn't about working to deny rights to those who are different, nor was he about supporting the powerful who ignore or abuse the stranger, the weak, the poor. Real Jesus taught and teaches, gave and gives unconditional love. The real Jesus of the Gospels thought and taught that people should be treated equally and that we must aim for peace through non-violence. He taught that we must relate to one another with love. Love, the desire for the well-being of everyone. Now, folks that didn't cotton to Jesus' idea back in his day didn't call him Pinko. They called him a rebel. And they arrested, and they tried, and convicted, and executed Jesus for being a rebel. We don't like to think of Jesus as a rebellious criminal. It's scandalous. We may not want to hear it. We may not like it, but there's no getting around it. We can try and spin the story, but scholars are convinced Jesus committed crimes. Jesus broke laws. John Deere, in his book, The Sacrament of Civil Disobedience, puts it like this: Jesus was a peacemaker who time and time again broke the laws that oppressed people and kept them like slaves to injustice. Jesus was not just provocative. His actions were illegal, civilly disobedient, and divinely obedient. Mahatma Gandhi wrote that Jesus was the most active resistor known perhaps to history. This was nonviolence par excellence. And I suspect that quote from Gandhi inspired the Facebook meme that reads, "The most effective activist in the history of the world was Yeshua of Nazareth." Jesus was a rebel. He really was. He was a gung-ho radical about love and peace, which is sadly not how we typically are taught to picture him on his way. And so I like seeing the picture of the way Jesus more likely would have looked. It visually reminds me to keep in mind that Jesus' origins are very different than from what we tend to think. And our sacraments have different origins than we tend to think as well. In our church and in most Protestant denominations, we have two sacraments: communion and baptism. Sacraments are outward signs, things that we do publicly, that we believe were instituted by God and convey an inward spiritual grace. Because Jesus was baptized, and because Jesus celebrated a Last Supper as marks of God's grace, we do so. When I first got into church as an adult in my 30s, I studied up on the sacraments, and I thought and I prayed a lot about them. What could be so sacred about a symbolic meal and a symbolic bit of water? What could they mean? And as you might imagine, I've studied both even more in seminary and as a pastor. And my conclusion has long been that, like our modern image of Jesus that masks what he really looked like, tradition has also placed masks over our sacrament's origins. I noted before, communion originated out of a custom of meal gatherings. Banquets were an important social event throughout the Roman Empire. They were hosted by the elite in order to maintain networks and loyalties with their underlings. And except at weddings, the banquets ordinarily were restricted to adult male guests who were important enough to fall within the sphere of influence of someone sufficiently wealthy to host a meal. And so these meals were fairly exclusive. Rome was a culture of exclusion on a massive scale. Many people were considered expendable: the sick, the poor, prisoners, slaves, strangers, women, children. Jesus' message of love all and treat all equally countered that on a massive scale, preaching in the very opposite direction. Instead of many being nobodies, all were somebodies. And one of the coolest things Jesus did was challenge the inequities of the Roman Empire by flipping that exclusive Roman meal tradition on its head. Jesus knocked down all barriers. Everyone gets to come to his table. All are invited. And consequently, all manner of people get fed and brought into the community. There are no expendables on Jesus' way. All are loved and matter much. It's a beautiful, God-soaked concept. And our communion table of bread and juice is a reenactment of Jesus' open table. And we also hold up and recall that Jesus gave his flesh and blood, leading a revolution and a rebellion of love in great part with that table. His body was broken for us. His blood was spilled because he dared to bring and champion a new sort of love into our lives, into the world. A love for all, with no strings attached. And that love has never stopped vibrating. And communion is a very visible sign and tactile remembrance of Jesus' radical rebellion against inequality and his message of God's radical love for everyone. And all this is background for reflection on Baptism of Christ Sunday, which is today. Jesus was baptized, and most of us are too. Jesus' baptism, as we heard in the reading, was done by John the Baptist, baptizing as a way to protest Rome's occupation of Palestine, its abuse of power, its unjust classism, and unfair and inhumane treatment of the majority of the population. John was rebelliously calling Jews to the desert wilderness to reenact Joshua's crossing of the River Jordan as to symbolically retake the promise. And on the way across the Jordan, they were to stop and confess their sins and be immersed by John's baptism of repentance, to be cleansed and initiated into his rebellious following for God. John's offer and practice of forgiveness by baptism sidestepped the Roman-controlled temple, its rites, and its expensive temple fees. And consequently, as John grew in popularity, he probably would have been perceived as a threat to those whose authority was grounded in the temple. This movement would have been understood as a protest against the temple and also against the Roman occupation of Palestine. As we heard in the reading today, Jesus was baptized. He took part in these protests and John's movement. As I mentioned, in the first century Palestine, there was a drastic inequality between the haves and the have-nots. The wealthy ruthlessly exploited the poor. And ruthlessness caused peasants to resist. And resistance movements like John's arose. And the Christian baptism ritual has its very roots in John the Baptist's God-centered resistance movement. Early in his ministry, Jesus followed John, and then he broke away and led his own resistance movement toward peace through love. Jesus' stand and actions that followed his baptism, stands against inequality, included transformation of common meal practice in a way that shattered cultural exclusive boundaries and called into question the inequalities of the Roman system. It uplifted God's way to peace through unconditional love. Jesus' baptism publicly signaled his involvement in John's earlier resistance movement when Jesus first set out on his mission and ministry, a mission and ministry that eventually evolved into his own way, about transforming the world from earthly powers' unloving reigns into a world where heavenly powers' love reigns. Communion and baptism have roots in two God-centered resistance movements. They were, and they are, about resisting oppression and calling forth God's justice. They are about believing in love and being love. And Christians have continued to publicly reenact and participate for 2,000 years in the sacraments, communion and baptism. And Christians on the way that Jesus led and leads, try to continue to proclaim Jesus' teachings in both word and in deed. And like the truer image of Jesus on the baptism, our image of baptism and communion should not be of our making, but of God's making. And it would serve us and the church and the world well to remember the radical nature of both. We're called to be rebels like Jesus, against the sins of inequality and injustice, and embrace love, the means to peace on earth. Simply put, our sacraments need to express through ritual not only our love of God, but our faith and our commitment to trying to live a life of love for others. Communion should lead to radical, transformative acts of love. Baptism should lead to radical, transformative acts of love. That is what both baptism and the Last Supper were about for Jesus, for Yeshua of Nazareth. May our baptism and communion inspire the same radical, transformative acts.